Here's what most people get wrong about creativity. One, they think it's an art. Not true. There's actually a process. Second, they don't think they have this creative gene that it's for other people. Also not true. It can work for you. And number three, they think creativity isn't something that's going to help them in their work, in their life. They feel like they're more practical, and that being creative sometimes makes them less practical. Not true. Fourth, they think creativity and financial planning are exclusive. Also not true. And finally, they think their work doesn't need more creativity. And to dispel all these myths, we invited to Mom's Basement George Newman. He's one of the leading minds on where creativity actually comes from, and he compares it much more to an archaeologist than to an artist. How? Well, that's coming up. And if you're working on something that could be more creative, tell us in the comments. I would love to chat more about that. Also, like this video so more people think about creativity in their financial plan. And third, subscribe for more videos. So let's go meet him. George Newman is going to help you be more creative.
I've been so excited about this conversation for a long time. George Newman joins us in the basement. How are you, man?
Great, Joe. Thanks so much for having me. This is awesome.
Well, I'm super happy that you're here because just making our stackers' lives a little more creative, a little more fun, and the fact that it's right in front of you, which we'll talk about a little bit, really gets me excited that, you know what, things can be a lot more creative for you. I have to ask you this question, and it's not something that's in your new work, but are you an Indiana Jones fan?
Oh, totally. Totally. I mean, I'm Raiders ride or die. Raiders of the Lost Ark is my favorite, but I love all of it. You know, in fact, actually, in early versions of the cover, I was like sending my publisher like old Indiana Jones posters and like, can we do something like this? Like I want to. So absolutely.
I'm disappointed they didn't. I'm disappointed.
I thought it would have worked for sure. Sure.
I totally think so. But now everybody, all of our stackers are going, what does Indiana Jones have to do with anything? But it's funny because I never thought before I dove into your work that finding good ideas had more to do with Indiana Jones than these, you know, I have this brilliant flash of light and the heavens open up and all of a sudden, you know, is some idea speaks to me, but it truly is more like Indiana Jones.
Absolutely. I mean, and I love that contrast because you think about somebody like Thomas Edison, right? You know, he's got thousands of patents. And I think the myth, at least that we have, is that Edison's off in some workshop just dreaming up these things. And the reality was totally different. You know, he had this idea factory. He had like 200 people working for him at one point, just cranking out ideas, filling, you know, thousands of notebooks. And a lot of them were failures, things like cement furniture and talking dolls. And even Edison talked about how ideas aren't brain-born. There's something that you have to go out into the world and find. So there's this real contrast between kind of the myth that we tell about creativity and then where it's actually coming from and what those really successful people are doing.
Yeah, and that is the key. And the reason, stackers, I bring up Indiana Jones is because of this idea that Indiana Jones is an archaeologist. He's not necessarily trying to be creative. He's looking at the past to see what's happening now. And to your point, going back to Edison, George, you make a point out that Edison had no problem riffing off of, I guess to put it kindly, other people's ideas.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he borrowed ruthlessly. You know, he had no problem riffing off of others. And he, you know, very much thought about ideas as being out in the world, as something that we have to go find. And I think what's so cool is that there's just a lot of research that really gives credence to that idea that we're seeing, you know, from Edison's time, but even using much more sophisticated modern methods now, we can say like, oh, wow, like maybe there's a very different way to think about this whole process.
Is there any research, by the way, that the flash of light ever truly happens? Like somebody truly just stumbles over something? Or is it 99% of the time we have a process for development and we create these great ideas from around us?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I like to think about it is kind of like an iceberg, right? That we see the very tip, which could be the finished idea. It could be the flash of the idea, because sometimes we've all had that feeling like you're taking a shower or whatever and it hits you. But then beneath the surface, there are all of these processes going on. Your unconscious mind, the research that you've done ahead of time, the way in which you've sought to make that problem systematic, and how you're paying attention to the environment. So all of these things that are going on, sometimes very much under your control and sometimes not really under your control or awareness, and so we might have the feeling in the end that, oh, an epiphany hit me. But oftentimes there's been actually a very slow, gradual process of trial and error kind of leading up to that point.
Let's riff on this idea then of archaeology, because you introduced this gentleman, I think he's from Kenya, who has this uncanny ability of knowing where to look for artifacts.
Yeah, Kamoya Kamu. He was employed by the Leakeys, and he lived in Kenya and didn't know anything about paleontology before he started working with them. And then nothing, zero. I think I've got a quote in there. I thought we were going to go dig up some graves. That's what he kind of thought was happening. And then he became the single greatest fossil hunter of all time. And in fact, so excellent that many of the paleontologists and archaeologists that came to that part of that world would hire Camus and his team to actually kind of source and find all of their big discoveries. And so then the question I ask is, well, what is he doing, right? And why is Camus so successful? And that it's not just an accident, because he actually wind up training generations of fossil hunters that worked with him. So he's teaching them something. And so what is he teaching them? Well, it's to really understand the landscape. It's to have a really great idea about where to look and what kinds of cues are going to be promising and where other things have been found in the past. So it's ultimately about knowledge and about being systematic and about being attentive, much more so than it is about being lucky.
Well, then there's the question then, George, for our average stacker listening to this, who's hoping to either for the company they work for or for themselves, maybe they're an entrepreneur, they want to come up with the next great idea. Where do we begin to survey? What is the magic of where he was looking that he was able to find more artifacts than anybody else?
So in the book, I kind of talk about this is the first step in this kind of archaeological dig process, which I call surveying, and talk about a few principles of surveying. So one really big one is, or what I call being an originality ostrich, that when we go to search for ideas, I think there's this tendency to say, I'm going to do something that nobody's ever thought of before. I'm going to kind of the deep blue ocean kind of mentality. And the reality is actually far different, that if you look at the most impactful ideas in science and in business and in lots of different domains, they actually are strikingly conventional. Oftentimes what people have done is they've started with kind of 95% of the idea grounded in things that are working, right? That it's successful and working in that environment, and then they put their own twist or spin on it. Talk about this as like the second mover advantage. And so that being a really, really powerful way of unlocking creativity, where instead of focusing so much on being original, you're instead saying, well, what's proven and what's valuable? And then how can I put my own unique spin on things?
You even talked about with this concept, if you're trying to be original, you did some studies to show you were more likely to not be original, to actually create some rotten stuff.
Yeah. So we did this great study with entrepreneurs, and we just said, okay, there's a storefront in town. Give us your best ideas for a business. Then we gave all those ideas to a different group, and how likely are people actually going to go to your business, to your store? And so people knew that going in generating ideas. And so some people gave us like really novel ideas, things like a lazy river store where I guess you would just kind of float around on an inner tube. And then there were other ideas that were like, high-end secondhand goods. And so when we asked our entrepreneurs, okay, so how likely are you to win this competition? How likely are people to go to your store? People thought the more original the idea, the better it would perform. And when we actually gave those ideas then to other people, it was the exact opposite. It was these kind of really wildly original ideas that like people weren't so interested in because, yeah, look, it's interesting, but it doesn't have a lot of value. And fascinatingly, we found the same thing among Top Chef contestants. So we analyzed 10 seasons of the show Top Chef and found that in episodes where a chef had said, I'm going to try to do something like really original that nobody's ever done before, they were like over 2 times as likely to be eliminated and kicked off the show. So there's something about, when we set out to come up with a new idea, a creative idea, that we're really overweighting this novelty aspect and kind of underestimating how difficult it is to come up with something that is both original, but also that people are going to actually want.
You write that we have this idea that creativity is this cabin in the woods, right? That I'm all alone, that my idea stands in the middle of nowhere. It is purely its own basic thing. Yeah. And you say we need to burn that idea because it's not that at all. It's much more like, to your point that you just made, it's much more riffing on something that is good but not great and maybe making it great.
Absolutely. Yeah. Chapter 1, Burn the Cabin Down, is all about this idea of we have this impulse. Okay, I've got this big deliverable coming up or whatever it might be, this project I really want to work on. Let me just isolate myself. Maybe it's not going to a literal cabin, but I'm going to get the fancy noise canceling headphones and I'm going to block out communication and I'm going to turn off all my devices and everything. And what the research tells us is the exact opposite, right? That's where your inspiration and ideas are going to come from, is actually by interacting with your environment and drawing on what's around you and those collaborations and feedback and a process of trial and error and exploration. So, get out of the metaphorical cabin and immerse yourself in the world, because that's where we find our spark of creativity.
Well, so then what are the questions that I ask myself then at first to find these great ideas? What spot of I don't know if it's my psyche or my life, do I begin to survey to go, these are where I'm more likely to find good ideas?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you can use a few different guiding principles there. One is do what you know. A big thing that I argue is, if we go back to Kamoya Camus and looking for fossils, right? You have to be able to recognize when something is out of place in the landscape, or hey, maybe that might be something over there. And if you don't have sufficient expertise in a domain, you might let a really great idea just kind of blow by you because you don't recognize it. So having expertise is really, really critical. The other big principle I talk about is just doing something that you're passionate about. And I'm sure we've all had this experience of, you're working on an idea and you start to tell your friends about it. And like before you even finish talking about it, you're like bored, or something, and like just drop those projects, because creativity is such a process and there is a lot of work in getting there. So if you're not super fired up and excited and jazzed about this thing and really hunting it down and finding, the best possible version of that idea, you're just never going to get there. And so, life is too short, or there's too many great ideas out there to spend it on these things that you're not totally passionate about.
It's funny because what you're saying is, if we start off with expertise and stuff we're passionate about, then we're going to know the topic deep enough that we know where the cracks are, right? Where the potentials. And yet I feel like for a lot of us, George, we feel like, well, if I get too close to this thing, I'm just going to copy it. Like I'm just going to be a ripoff of this thing. And I don't want to do that.
Yeah, that is definitely a worry that comes up. The really cool part is that we're not great copiers, that I think we can't help but put our own spin on things. And even if you sit down, just try it. Like, if you're a musician, take your favorite musician and try to redo their song, or visual artist or writing or whatever, or even a business proposal. In trying to copy it identically, you will inevitably put your own spin on things. It has to kind of come out in a different way. And so I think there's an acknowledgement that we're imperfect in doing that. The other big thing that I argue in the book is that copying is largely about learning, and that even if you try to do a one-for-one copy, what you're really doing is stepping inside the mind of that person. Why did they make certain decisions? Why did they make these choices? Why did they follow one step with this next step? And it's not until you really get in the weeds and start trying to make the thing yourself that you realize, oh, okay, like there's a lot of stuff that I didn't necessarily appreciate about this process. So copying itself can be a really powerful way of learning. And I talk a lot about visual artists where you see a very consistent pattern of starting by imitating other people's work. And then you see this kind of very slight deviation away from it. And they're drifting farther and farther. And then they kind of hit something that's totally different, that's their own, that has this kind of 95%, 5% quality where they've put their own spin, but now it's totally recognizable to them. And then they really start unearthing that for all it's worth. So there's a lot of value in starting by copying and just saying, well, what can I learn from these other people?
I took poetry classes in college, and it's phenomenal, George, that our professor, who had us just call her Catherine, she wore black every day. I mean, you kind of think that when you think poetry, don't you?
Yeah, totally.
Of course, call me by my first name, and all I do is wear black every day. But she had us very specifically do exactly what you're talking about, and with no fear, copy some of the great poets and make it line by line the same, but using your own words. And as you learned about the cadence and the meter and what they did, and we got closer to these people, then later on, when I started having to write my own poetry, it actually was far easier to riff off it. Which brings up another idea that you bring to the forefront, which was this idea of a hot streak. Like I feel like it's once one of these artists or a regular person gets in this groove, right? And they find maybe where gold has been before and they start mining for it. They then find more and more. Can we talk about Jackson Pollock for a minute and how his hot streak led to some of the best artistic works the world has ever seen?
Totally. So Pollock, the guy famous for the drip paintings or action paintings.
The ones I always look at and I go, oh my God, so much money for just flicking paint.
We can talk about it. There's actually a lot more going on in those paintings. But Pollock experimented with a lot of different styles, and all of those paintings that we recognize as like kind of classic Pollocks came from a very short window of time, about 3 years. He was doing different stuff beforehand and wound up doing different things afterwards before he died. So there's a great team of researchers at Northwestern that didn't just look at Pollock. They looked at 30,000 different scientists and visual artists and filmmakers. There's been additional research looking at entrepreneurs, finding the same hot streak pattern that if you look at the trajectory of people's careers, their biggest hits aren't kind of smoothly spread out and they don't increase in likelihood over time. They're actually punctuated in a very short window, almost as if, they were searching around, stumbled onto a cache of gold or treasure or fossils, and then just mined it and got everything out of the ground that they can. And so that pattern, I think, is really, really persuasive in telling us, well, there's something much deeper going on here than just people waiting for that light bulb moment, right? That there seems to be something almost getting it out of the ground or drawing it from the environment that is responsible for creativity. And Pollock, you're talking about the drip paintings. I talk about how physicists have analyzed those paintings, and actually they conform to this very rich fractal pattern, which is the same pattern that describes the branching of trees in nature. And in fact, Pollock's painting, his drip paintings, got closer to this fractal pattern over time, suggesting that he was kind of intuitively aware. I don't think he was consciously aware of it, because you need these really sophisticated algorithms to detect it, but intuitively aware of the fact that, okay, I'm onto something here. There is this structure, and he's actually getting closer to that structure over time. So by the end, his paintings are conforming to that structure by like 90% or something like that. So
I found that so creepy.
Yeah, it's and here's the really, really cool part is a different team of physicists who are looking at Zen gardens and looking at the placement of objects in Zen gardens, and these Zen gardens that have been preserved for hundreds of years, they found that that same fractal pattern was there in describing not where the objects were placed, but that actually the negative spaces in between the objects formed the same kind of branching structure. So now you have very wildly different kinds of artists and creativity kind of zeroing in on the same core idea, like hundreds of years apart, which is so cool.
I love this idea just of mining to find the truth and to find the essence of the thing.
Yeah.
I love board games. Our stackers know, and there's a bunch of them, by the way. George just rolled their eyes when I brought up board games, like, oh God, Joe's bringing up board games again. But there's this great board game designer named Alan Moon, and Alan created this game in the 90s called Airlines, which is a good game. Later on, he creates a game called Union Pacific. And if you play Airlines and you play Union Pacific, you realize that he's iterating off of Airlines, but now it's more streamlined. It's better put together. Union Pacific's a game I like a lot. That morphs again a few years later into a game called Santa Fe Rails. And then it morphs again into one of the best-selling games of all time. A game a lot of people, even if you're not a board game fan, you probably heard of this game, a game called Ticket to Ride.
Oh, sure.
That now is worldwide, and so many people played Ticket to Ride. But he didn't come up with it at first, and he was doing exactly this process that you're talking about that Pollock and other people are doing. He's mining for gold, and he doesn't hit it right away.
Yeah. I'm sure you're familiar with this story. I talk about it in the book of the Monopoly and how Monopoly came to be. And the kind of myth about Monopoly is Charles Darrow, and that, he just kind of stumbled into this game and voila. But it really, has this really cool origin. This woman named Liz Maggie developed a board game called the Landlord's Game that was really supposed to kind of communicate these economic principles about taxation and redistribution at the time. And her game was pretty complicated. It had these two different sets of rules, like a distribution rule and then a monopolist rule. And that game didn't go anywhere. But then Parker Brothers and Darrow wound up acquiring it from her, and they kind of dropped the redistribution part and just had the monopolist part. And then, you have Monopoly. So it had that kind of similar story that I always thought was really cool.
For people who want to know more about that, actually, George, we interviewed Mary Pilon, who wrote a whole book about that and about how, and it's funny, the unintended consequence of, creating something that says capitalism is bad makes all these fraternity boys go, we love capitalism. We're just gonna tear each other to pieces. You find something promising though, and then you put in the work, I think is the big aha here. I think for a lot of people, it's not about, I get hit over the head with this great idea and all of a sudden Monopoly's born or Jackson Pollock's born. There's a ton of work that happens here, and you don't have to be a genius. I think there's a big aha there as well, that I don't have to be a genius to create these great ideas.
That's right. We're exploring in the environment. We know where we're looking. We know what we're looking for. And then we get a little bit lucky and we find something that's promising. But then that's, again, where the expertise comes in being able to recognize that and say, well, what's the right way to refine this? And what's the right way to iterate on it? And how do I try out now different permutations to figure out what's going to be more successful in the environment? And how do I draw on the constraints? The opposite of thinking outside the box. How do I think inside the box to use those constraints to my advantage to make this idea better? So yeah, now then there's a lot of work from there to say, have I found the best version of this idea? And what else are its nearest neighbors? And can I exploit all of that and use that to my advantage?
Is that the biggest, I guess, misinformation about where good ideas come from, is the fact that I think I have to be a genius? Or do you think there's something else that we all believe that just simply isn't true?
I certainly think that's one of them, that we think about great ideas as only coming from these kind of genius figures, especially like a lone genius, right? And that's really a myth, that if you go back through history, it's very, very difficult to find isolated individuals who are just kind of smacked with an idea out of nowhere, especially if they're not already deeply immersed in the domain. And in fact, the opposite is really what's true. You have a lot of people, it's building on a lot of ideas that have come before. there's a lot there that is due to the environment. In fact, a really fascinating phenomenon is called multiple discovery, that throughout history, there have been just hundreds and hundreds of instances of people actually arriving at the same idea at the same time. And everything from the theory of evolution to, the telescope, to the thermometer, to the telephone, and, talk about like movies that in 2018, like there's like 2 movies released in different countries about middle-aged men that form synchronized swimming teams. Like how does that happen? Right? That there's something in the air, something that people are responding to that is guiding them towards, hey, like I think that there's something potentially promising here, and being able to recognize that in your environment, and then as we were talking about, exploit it. How do we take advantage of that recognition and use it?
The book is called How Great Ideas Happen, The Hidden Steps Behind Breakthrough Success. We start off where we did today, surveying things that we know and that we love. For me, it'd be board games. It could be finding fossils, could be whatever you want it to be. But I love the fact that this explores a territory that we're all interested in and can help us become better at whatever we're trying to do. And yet, George, we're all looking in the wrong place. We're all looking exactly the wrong spot.
Totally. I mean, ultimately, creativity, we think about it as like, it's got to be messy. It's like art or music or poetry or something. But really what creativity is describing is a process of things improving and getting better. And we all want to make improvements in our lives, right? Whether they're big or small. And so thinking about those improvements as coming from a process of discovery rather than I've got to be a lone genius out in the world.
Yeah, thanks a ton for coming on and mentoring our stackers on finding our hidden genius that we don't even need to be a genius, which is fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joe.